Imagine you're an American soldier in 1776. You're huddled behind a stone wall at Bunker Hill, looking down the slope at a line of British infantry. They're wearing bright scarlet coats, not brown, not green, not grey, scarlet. The kind of red you can see from half a mile away on a cloudy day. Your musket has a rifled barrel. You can kill a man at 300 yards. You're thinking to yourself, these idiots are wearing target practice. Here's the thing that doesn't make sense. You're right. They are wearing target practice. And they know it. They've known it for decades. And yet, for another 120 years after Bunker Hill, British soldiers kept wearing red into battle. Through the Napoleonic Wars, through the Crimean War, through the Zulu War, through the First Boer War, where Boer farmers with German hunting rifles picked them off from 1,000 yards, through the Sudan, where they finally stopped. So what the hell were they thinking? Was it tradition? Stupidity? Some kind of suicidal commitment to looking good while getting shot? No. The real answer is stranger, smarter, and way more interesting than any of that. And it has nothing to do with hiding blood. I'm going to tell you why the British Army wore red for 250 years, why they kept wearing it long after every sane person knew it was a death sentence, and what finally made them change. By the time we're done, you're going to understand something about the British Army that most people never figure out. Something that explains why they fought the way they did, why they won as often as they lost, and why the red coat became one of the most terrifying symbols in military history. Let's start with the myth you've probably heard, because it's the one that needs killing first. If you've ever watched a documentary or read a pop history book, you've heard some version of this. The British wore red so the blood wouldn't show. If a soldier was hit, the theory goes, his mates wouldn't see the blood and wouldn't lose morale. It sounds plausible. It's also complete and utter nonsense. Blood on red serge doesn't disappear. It turns into a stark, glossy black stain that stands out like a neon sign. Any soldier who's ever been wounded in a red coat could tell you that. The myth probably started with a 16th century military writer named Julius Ferretus, who suggested it in passing. He was wrong then, and it's wrong now. So, if it wasn't about hiding blood, what was it? Let's go back to the beginning. The red coat wasn't chosen for battlefield advantage. It was chosen for the most boring reason in military history. It was cheap. In 1645, Oliver Cromwell's Parliament was putting together the new model army, the first professional standing army in English history. They needed uniforms for 22,000 men, and they needed them fast. The cheapest dye on the market was something called Venetian red, made from madder root. It was readily available, it was colour fast, and most importantly, the government could buy it in bulk from contractors who were fighting each other for the lowest bid. A contemporary observer wrote in May 1645, "The men are redcoats all, the whole army only are distinguished by the several facings of their coats." That's it. That's the origin story. The British Army wore red because someone in procurement got a good deal. But here's where it gets interesting. After the monarchy was restored in 1660, the army kept the red coats, and after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, they kept them again. By the early 18th century, red was no longer just a cheap dye, it was tradition, and tradition in the British Army is a hell of a drug. There's another reason though, and this one actually makes tactical sense. For most of the redcoats' existence, battles were fought with black powder. You've seen the movies, the lines of men, the volleys, the clouds of white smoke that hang over the battlefield like a London fog. What the movies don't capture is how utterly impossible it was to see anything after the first exchange. A British officer at the Battle of the Alma in 1854 wrote to his father that he was given no instructions during the battle because his superiors literally couldn't see him through the smoke. In that environment, visibility wasn't a bug, it was a feature. The red coat was designed to be seen. If you were a soldier in a line, you looked to your left and right. You saw the red of your regiment, and you knew where you were. you were an officer on horseback, you could find your men in the chaos. If you were a general trying to coordinate an attack, the red line was your compass. It sounds counterintuitive to modern ears. We're used to camouflage, to hiding, to blending in. But for 200 years, the British Army's tactical doctrine was built around massed firepower and shock action. You didn't win by sniping from behind rocks. You won by advancing in line, delivering a devastating volley at close range, and then charging with the bayonet. The red coat was a tool for that kind of warfare. It kept the formation together. And in the age of the musket, the formation was everything. Now let's fast forward to the 1850s, the Crimean War. This is where the redcoats' days really start to be numbered. The Russians at the Battle of Alma in September 1854 were armed with rifled muskets, not smoothbores, rifles. They could kill British soldiers from twice the range that the British could kill them. And yet, the British infantry went in wearing scarlet. They took horrific casualties, but they won. Why? Because the red coat, for all its visibility, still served a purpose. In the smoke and confusion of the Alma, the British lines held together while the French, who wore dark blue, ended up shooting each other by mistake. 2 months later, at Balaclava, something happened that gave the red coat its most famous moment. A massive Russian cavalry charge was heading straight for the British base. In its path stood the 93rd Sutherland Highlanders, about 500 men in scarlet tunics, lined up 2 deep. They didn't have time to form square. They just stood there, a thin red line against a wall of horsemen, and they held. The Russians broke. A war correspondent for the Times, a man named William Russell, wrote that what stood between the Russian cavalry and the British base was nothing but a thin red streak tipped with a line of steel. That phrase, the thin red line, became legendary. It captured something about the British soldier that the army itself had been cultivating for 2 centuries. The idea that a handful of men in red coats, standing firm, could stop anything. The red coat wasn't just a uniform anymore. It was a symbol. But symbols don't stop bullets. After the Crimea, the British Army had a problem. Rifles were getting better. Smokeless powder was on the horizon. The old justification for red, visibility in smoke, was becoming obsolete. And then came the Boer War. The first Boer War in 1881 was a wake-up call. The Boers were farmers, not professional soldiers, but they had modern German hunting rifles and they knew how to use them. They fought from cover, in khaki-coloured clothing that blended into the veldt. The British came in scarlet, with white crossbelts and gleaming brass buttons, targets so perfect that a Boer marksman later said he could hit a British soldier at 1,000 yards without even using the sights. The British lost. Badly. At the Battle of Majuba Hill, a force of Boer marksmen picked off a British column that was trying to advance uphill in scarlet tunics. The commanding general was killed. The army was humiliated. You'd think that would have been the end of the red coat. It wasn't. The British Army fought its last battle in scarlet and blue at Guinness in the Sudan on December 30th, 1885. A small expeditionary force sent from Britain wore their home service uniforms, scarlet tunics, blue trousers, into battle against the Mahdist rebels. One detachment that reached Khartoum by steamer was ordered to fight in red specifically, so the Mahdists would know that the real British Army had arrived. It was a statement. It was also the last time. But here's what almost nobody knows. Even after khaki was officially adopted in 1902, most British infantry regiments kept their scarlet tunics for parade, for walking out, for the occasions when they wanted to remind everyone who they were. Out of 85 infantry regiments, 81 continued to wear red for off-duty and ceremonial purposes, right up until the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. Why? Because the British Army understood something that modern audiences often miss. A uniform isn't just about hiding, it's about identity. It's about what you're fighting for. The red coat had become the physical embodiment of 250 years of military tradition, of victories won, of empires built, of enemies broken. You don't throw that away just because someone invented a better rifle. The final nail in the coffin wasn't the Boer War. It wasn't the Crimea. It was money. After the First World War, the British government was broke. The scarlet cloth used for officers' tunics required expensive cochineal dye, imported from Mexico. It was a luxury the army could no longer afford. The foot guards, the household division, resumed wearing their scarlet full dress in 1920, but for the rest of the army, red became a memory, preserved only in mess dress and the occasional ceremonial occasion. In 1980, the army actually considered bringing scarlet back, using cheaper chemical dyes instead of cochineal. They surveyed serving soldiers. The response was lukewarm at best. The idea was quietly shelved. So where does that leave us? If you go to London today, you'll see red coats at Buckingham Palace, at the Tower of London, at Horse Guards. The Foot Guards still wear them. The household cavalry still wears them. They're ceremonial now, not tactical. But they're not just costumes. They're a direct line to something that the British Army spent 3 centuries perfecting. Think about what the red coat represents. It represents an army that understood the psychology of battle better than almost anyone. It represents a doctrine built around discipline, shock, and the unshakable belief that a well-trained soldier in a line was worth 10 men hiding behind rocks. It represents a willingness to be seen, to be counted, to stand your ground when everything in you wants to run. The French went into the First World War wearing bright blue tunics and red trousers. The Germans called them the Red Trousers Army. They took catastrophic casualties in the first weeks of the war, so many that by 1915 they had switched to a duller colour called horizon blue. The British had already made that mistake, learned from it, and moved on. But they never forgot what the red coat meant. There's a reason that phrase, the thin red line, still echoes today. It's not about the colour, it's about what the colour stood for. An army that knew its own strengths, that understood that sometimes you have to be visible to be effective, that held the line when everything was telling you to break. So the next time you see a picture of a British soldier from the Napoleonic Wars or the Crimea, don't just see a target, see a soldier who knew exactly how visible he was and wore it anyway. Because he understood something that we've forgotten in our world of camouflage and drones and precision-guided everything. Sometimes the most dangerous thing on the battlefield isn't the person you can't see. It's the person who wants you to see him coming. I'm going to be making more videos about British military history, the stories behind the uniforms, the battles, the decisions that shaped how armies fight. If you want to understand the real reasons behind the things you see in history books and movies, hit that subscribe button. And while you're at it, leave a comment. Do you think the British Army held on to the red coat for too long? Or was it worth it for what it represented? I read every comment. Thanks for watching.